Hey there, friends. Welcome back to American Pulse and Paranormal. If you're a fan of spine-chilling stories that keep you up at night, you've definitely come to the right place. But before we dive into tonight's eerie tale where shadows, whisper, and fear takes shape, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Are you sneaking a listen late at night, or maybe unwinding after a long day? Your comments help us connect with our incredible audience and make this community even stronger. So, are you ready to face the unknown? Let's get started. Story 1. The Child in the Mirror. In the small, quiet town of Ashford, tucked away from the bustling cities, stood an old, dilapidated house at the end of Maple Street. The house, with its faded brick walls and overgrown garden, had long been abandoned. Townsfolk often spoke of it with a mix of fear and curiosity. Some claimed they saw flickers of light through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, while others swore they heard strange noises coming from within the house late at night. But no one ever dared venture inside, not until Emily. Emily was a curious 16-year-old with a love for mysteries. Unlike her friends who feared the unknown, Emily found it thrilling. Her fascination with the house on Maple Street began when she overheard an old woman in the town's cafe talking about strange occurrences that had been happening around the house for decades. The woman spoke of whispers in the night, of shadows that moved on their own, and of a mirror that hung in the hallway rumored to be cursed. One chilly autumn afternoon, Emily decided it was time to see for herself. She grabbed her backpack, filled it with essentials: a flashlight, her phone, and a notebook to document anything strange, and set out for the house. As she approached the front door, a gust of wind blew through the trees, causing the dry leaves to swirl around her feet. The house looked even more eerie up close, the silence pressing against her ears like a heavy weight. But Emily wasn't scared. Not yet. The front door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and she immediately noticed the musty smell of decay. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, broken furniture, and cobwebs hanging from every corner. With each step, Emily's heart began to race. The house was eerily still, and the silence was broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. But there was something else, something almost imperceptible. She could hear faint whispers in the air, as if someone were speaking just out of earshot. She paused, trying to catch the words, but there was nothing. Then, in the dim light, she saw it. A large mirror hung at the end of the hallway. It was old, its surface tarnished and cracked, but the frame was still intricately carved, depicting twisting vines and strange symbols. Emily felt drawn to it, as if it were calling her. She approached slowly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet house. When she stood in front of the mirror, she was startled by how clear her reflection looked. Too clear. It was as though the mirror was too perfect, too lifelike. She stood there for a moment, studying her reflection, when something strange began to happen. Her own image started to blur at the edges. Her reflection seemed to shift, the colors distorting in a way that didn't seem natural. As her eyes widened in confusion, she noticed a small figure standing behind her in the mirror. The figure was pale, almost translucent, and as Emily turned around, she saw nothing, just the empty hallway. She spun back to the mirror, her breath quickening. The figure was still there, its hand pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through. Terrified, Emily stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror, watching as the figure's expression changed from an eerie smile to something more sinister. The whispering grew, louder, more urgent, and Emily felt a chill creep up her spine. She tried to turn and run, but her legs felt heavy, as though the house itself were holding her in place. The air grew colder, and she could see her breath in front of her. It was then that she realized the whispers weren't just in the air, they were coming from the mirror. They were speaking directly to her, their voices layered, overlapping, as if many people were speaking at once. Emily's mind raced. What did it mean? What was this thing in the mirror? Desperate to escape, Emily tried to leave the hallway, but the house seemed to shift around her. She looked down at the floor, expecting to see the same warm, creaky boards she had stepped on just moments ago, but now they looked different, newer. The hallway stretched out before her, and she realized that she wasn't sure which direction she had come from. The house was changing, shifting its shape, trapping her in a maze of hallways and rooms that didn't make sense. With a burst of panic, Emily ran toward the front door, hoping to escape the nightmare she had unwittingly walked into. But when she reached the door, she found it locked. She pulled at the handle, rattling the door, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the door, shouting for help, but her voice was muffled, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the sound. Turning round in desperation, Emily spotted the mirror once again at the far end of the hallway. This time, it seemed even clearer, the glass shimmering in the dim light. As she looked into it, she saw the small child from earlier, standing directly behind her, a twisted smile spreading across its face. The child's eyes were empty, hollow, and it reached out, pressing its hand against the glass. Emily screamed, stumbling backward, but the house was silent once more. She was trapped in a place that no longer made sense, surrounded by whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. And the only thing she could trust was the cold reflection in the mirror that now held her captive. The house felt alive, its walls pulsating with an unnatural energy. The air was thick, heavy with the presence of something ancient. Emily's mind spun with fear as the shadows around her seemed to deepen, moving on their own, as if they were alive, observing her every move. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence, so deafening that it felt suffocating. Without warning, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging her into pitch blackness. Emily's breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to find a way out. She couldn't stay in this nightmare forever. Then she heard it, a soft, distant giggle, high-pitched and childlike. It echoed from the darkness. The sound sent a jolt of fear through her chest. The child from the mirror, was it here? Was it real? Her heart raced as she felt her way through the dark, her fingers brushing against the walls. She couldn't tell if she was moving forward or backward. The house had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning, making it impossible to find a way out. But then, through the darkness, she saw a faint glow. A single light flickered at the end of a hallway. Desperation surged within her as she rushed toward it, ignoring the sense of dread creeping up her spine. The child's giggle grew louder, closer. She wasn't alone. As she reached the light, she turned the corner and saw the door, the front door, the one she had tried to escape from earlier. It was wide open now, a path to freedom, or so she thought. But as she stepped toward it, the door slammed shut with a violent force, locking her in once again. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "You can't leave," they seemed to say. You belong to us now." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned back toward the mirror, her reflection now twisted beyond recognition. The child's figure was there, standing beside her alive, real and grinning. Emily stood there, frozen, as the cold air seemed to intensify around her. The faint whispers that had been echoing from the mirror became louder, now a chaotic blend of voices. All speaking at once, they were no longer just whispers. They were urgent, almost desperate, as if the mirror itself were trying to communicate something to her. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat began to form on her brow. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and she could see her breath in the dim light. She forced herself to take a step back, her legs heavy as though the house itself were trying to hold her in place. The child's figure in the mirror seemed to grow clearer with every passing second, its hand pressing against the glass more forcefully, its eyes still hollow, yet now there was something different about its expression, something darker. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to shift. The house groaned as if alive, its creaking sounds growing louder, almost as if it were responding to her fear. Emily tried to turn to flee, but the floor beneath her feet shifted, and the hallway stretched out impossibly long. She glanced down. At the ground, what had once been creaky, worn boards now appeared newer, as if the house itself were changing before her eyes. She swallowed hard and stepped forward, each movement feeling more and more disconnected from reality. Every corner she turned led her to another room that seemed to be a mirror image of the one before. The doors she had passed, the broken furniture, the peeling wallpaper, all of it now looked oddly familiar, as if the house was no longer obeying the laws of physics, or logic for that matter. "What's happening?" Emily whispered to herself, her voice trembling. Her mind raced. Was she hallucinating? Was it the fear, the exhaustion, or something far more sinister? The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. They seemed to surround her, filling the entire house. They were no longer just voices. They were thoughts, foreign, invasive thoughts pressing into her mind. The mirror. She had to get back to the mirror. Emily turned back toward the hallway, but the space before her felt wrong, too long, too distorted. It was as though the very fabric of the house was shifting, stretching, warping as she moved. The layout of the rooms was constantly changing, like a labyrinth with no escape. Every time she thought she had found a door, it led to a wall. Every turn only took her deeper into the house. Her pulse quickened. There was no clear direction now, no familiar path back to the front door. It was as if the house had a mind of its own, keeping her trapped in a maze of its making. Then, as if on cue, she heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but saw nothing. The hallway was empty, save for the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps came again, this time closer. Closer to her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she reached for the flashlight in her pocket. She flicked it on, but the beam of light revealed nothing but more empty, shifting walls. The air grew colder still. Her body screamed for her to run, to leave the house, but her feet refused to move. The whispers in her mind grew louder, drowning out everything else. "Look at the mirror. You must look." The voice was no longer coming from the mirror. It was in her head, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The child's hollow, soulless eyes stared at her from every direction, pulling her in. "Look at the mirror. It's the only way out." Panic rose in her chest. She didn't want to look, didn't want to face whatever it was that was waiting for her on the other side. But something was pushing her forward. an unseen force guiding her steps. As she walked, the house seemed to grow colder with each step. The walls became even darker, more suffocating. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her feet felt heavy, as if each step took her further away from reality and deeper into the abyss of whatever this place was. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the hallway, and then there it was, the mirror. She stood before it again, her reflection staring back at her with those empty, dead eyes. But this time, there was something different. The figure of the child in the mirror was no longer just a faint silhouette. It was standing right there, inches from the glass, its face pressed against it, its fingers curling around the edges of the frame as though trying to break through. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figure was moving now, its twisted smile growing wider, its eyes no longer vacant but filled with malice. It reached out with its small, pale hand, and the air around Emily grew even colder. She could see the fog of her breath condense on the surface of the mirror as she inched closer, unable to stop herself. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror. The figure did not answer. Instead, it moved again, its fingers now almost touching the glass, as if inviting her in. Without thinking, Emily reached out toward the mirror. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold surface, a sharp jolt ran through her body, and the world around her began to warp and twist. The air around her grew thick, the walls of the house dissolving, and she found herself standing in complete darkness. The whispers ceased, the coldness vanished. It was as though the house, the mirror, everything had been wiped away. And then she saw them, the eyes, hundreds of them, eyes of all shapes and sizes, floating in the darkness, staring at her with an unblinking intensity. They surrounded her, closing in from all sides, and Emily couldn't move. She couldn't scream. One of the eyes up the front began to grow larger, until it consumed everything in its path. It was a deep, dark black, with no iris, no pupil, just emptiness. It stared at her, and Emily felt herself drawn to it, helpless to stop herself. Suddenly, a voice echoed through her mind, cold and cruel. "Welcome home." The darkness closed in, and the last thing Emily saw was the reflection of her own face, distorted and twisted, looking back at her from the mirror. Then, everything went silent. Story 2. The Mysterious Box. In a small, quiet town nestled deep within the woods, there was a peculiar little antique shop that no one really paid much attention to. The shop, tucked between two towering buildings, was easy to miss unless you were looking for it. The windows were dusty, and the wooden sign swayed gently in the breeze, barely legible in the dim light of the street lamp. The shop had a strange, almost magnetic pull, one that seemed to draw people in without them fully understanding why. Sarah, a curious young woman with an insatiable need to explore, was walking down the street one crisp autumn evening when something caught her eye. She had passed the shop countless times before, but tonight it felt different. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from within. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity got the better of her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old books and mothballs. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with strange objects, tarnished silverware, faded paintings, ancient clocks, and trinkets from another era. The shop was dimly lit, the light casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. A bell chimed softly as Sarah entered, and a voice called out from the back of the store. "Can I help you?" An elderly man emerged from the shadows. His name was Mr. Hawthorne, and his face was weathered with age. He had a peculiar way of looking at people, as if he could see right through them. His eyes, though cloudy with age, were sharp, and they seemed to flicker with something unsettling. Sarah smiled politely. "Just browsing," she said, her voice light.mer. Hawthorne nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. He didn't speak, but the silence between them felt thick, almost as if he were waiting for her to ask about something. She didn't know why, but she had the odd sensation that she was being watched, scrutinized, as she wandered deeper into the shop. Sarah's fingers brushed against an old wooden chest that sat in the corner of the room. It was intricately carved, with swirling patterns and symbols she didn't recognize. The box was small, no larger than a showbox, but it was heavy, and naturally so. There was something strange about it, something that made her want to reach out and touch it, even though she didn't know why. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she knelt down to examine the box more closely. As she did, Mr. Hawthorne appeared behind her, his footsteps silent on the old wooden floor. "That box," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "You should leave it alone." Sarah jumped slightly, surprised by his sudden appearance. She looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking just a little. Mer. Hawthorne stared at the box, then at her. "It's not meant for you. It's a dangerous thing." But Sarah, ever the skeptic, didn't heed his warning. She picked up the box, feeling its weight in her hands. It was colder than she had expected, almost as if it had been sitting in ice for years. As she turned it over, she noticed a small, rusted keyhole on the side. "What's inside?" she asked. Her curiosity piqued. Mer. Hawthorne's face hardened. "It's better you don't know," he said, his voice sharp. "Please, leave it here." But Sarah, against her better judgment, couldn't resist. She had to know. Ignoring the old man's protests, she bought the box and left the shop. The moment she stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop. A chill ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, as Sarah sat in her room, she stared at the box. The strange symbols etched into its surface seemed to dance in the dim light, twisting and turning like they were alive. She ran her fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves in the wood. It was as if the box were calling to her, urging her to open it. Without thinking, Sarah inserted a small knife she had found into the keyhole and twisted. There was a sharp click, and the lid of the box slowly creaked open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. At least, that's what it seemed at first. But as Sarah peered deeper into the box, her eyes began to adjust to the dark, and she saw something moving within, something alive. It was small, almost imperceptible at first, but it began to take shape, a shadowy figure, shifting and writhing, as though it were made of smoke. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The air grew thick, as if the darkness inside the box were spilling out, consuming everything around her. She slammed the lid shut, but it was too late. A voice, faint at first, whispered in her ear. It was a low, guttural sound like a breath against her skin. "You shouldn't have opened it." Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. She was alone, or so she thought. A chill ran through her, and she could feel the presence in the room, lurking just out of sight. It wasn't until the shadows in the corners of her room began to move, slowly, deliberately, that she realized the horror she had unleashed. The box wasn't just an object, it was a gateway. And whatever was inside it was now free to roam. Sarah had always been drawn to the mysterious as a child. She would spend hours in her grandmother's attic, sifting through old trunks filled with forgotten treasures, but nothing had ever captured her curiosity quite like the box. It was small, no larger than a showbox, made of dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. The carvings on its surface were intricate, almost hypnotic, depicting scenes that shifted and changed when viewed from different angles. Her grandmother had warned her about it once. In a rare moment of clarity, "Some doors are better left closed," she had said, her voice trembling. "Some things are not meant to be found," but Sarah had dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman. Now, standing in the dimly lit attic, she wished she had listened. The box had called to her. Its presence almost magnetic. She had found it hidden beneath a pile of dusty old books, its surface cool to the touch. As she lifted it, a shiver ran down her spine, and she felt an inexplicable urge to open it. The lid was heavy, but it gave way with a soft creak, revealing an empty interior. At first, she felt a pang of disappointment, but then the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the seconds passed, they grew louder, more insistent. The air around her grew colder, and the shadows in the attic seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were alive. She could feel something watching her, something ancient and malevolent. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her palms were slick with sweat as she looked around the room. The shadows had deepened, stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. The air was thick with an ominous energy that seemed to warp everything around her. Every corner of the room now seemed like a potential hiding place for the unknown entity that had been released from the box. The whispering returned, this time louder, more urgent. The voices weren't just whispering anymore, they were talking directly to her. The words were indecipherable, overlapping in a chaotic frenzy, a cacophony of unintelligible sounds that grated against her mind like nails on a chalkboard. Her head spun, and she clenched her hands into fists, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices were everywhere, filling the space, crawling inside her mind. "You shouldn't have opened it," one voice hissed, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the walls. Another voice followed, high-pitched and mocking, "You freed us. Now you belong to us." Sarah shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. "No, I didn't mean to," she whispered to herself, as if convincing herself that she could undo the mistake. But deep down, she knew it was too late. There was no turning back now. As the room seemed to close in around her, she heard the distinct sound of a door creaking open. Sarah spun around, but no one was there. The whispers grew louder, now more distinct, calling her name. Her breath quickened as she backed away from the darkened doorway, the fear in her chest rising like a tidal wave. It was then that the figure appeared. A tall, thin silhouette stepped into the doorway, its features obscured by the darkness. It was a shadow, no, something more than that. Its form seemed to shift and bend unnaturally, like smoke or liquid darkness. As it moved closer, Sarah could feel its presence, an overwhelming sense of dread that flooded her senses. It was no longer just a figment of her imagination. It was real. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with an eerie cold light. They were not human eyes, but something far older, far more malevolent. The figure moved with a fluid grace, its limbs stretching unnaturally, as if it were not bound by the same rules that governed the physical world. The shadow seemed to wrap around it, as if the very darkness was its servant. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body was frozen, unable to move. The figure stepped closer, its form now fully visible in the dim light. It was a tall, thin creature, draped in tattered robes that seemed to flicker like shadows. Its hands were long and bony, with fingers that stretched out toward her, the tips curling like claws. "You opened the box," the creature hissed, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to echo in her skull. "Now you must pay the price." Sarah wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her body was paralyzed by fear, her legs refusing to move. The creature's voice reverberated in her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her feel small, insignificant. It was as if she were nothing more than a pawn in a game she didn't understand, and this creature was the one pulling the strings. The room seemed to darken even further, the shadows creeping closer as the creature advanced. She could feel the chill in the air, the oppressive weight of its presence pushing down on her. It was not just the fear of the unknown that terrified her, it was the overwhelming certainty that she was now part of something much larger, much darker than she could ever comprehend. The creature's hand reached out, its long fingers brushing against her arm. The cold touch sent a jolt of electricity through her body, and she gasped in shock. It felt like ice, like death itself had touched her. She wanted to pull away, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. "You belong to me now," the creature whispered, "and I will never let you go." Story 3. The Last Message. Emily Carter had always been the type to check her phone obsessively. As a journalism student at Blackwood University, she thrived on constant connectivity, social media alerts, news updates, group chats. Her world was shaped by the constant flow of information, and she relied on it to stay ahead in her studies and personal life. But on a rainy Tuesday evening, as she sat in the cramped dorm room she shared with her best friend, Mia, a single text message shattered her sense of normalcy. It came through at 3:07 a.m., slicing through the silence like a blade. Emily, bleary-eyed from cramming for an exam, glanced at the screen. The sender's number was just a string of random digits. The message itself was short: "Don't open the door." She frowned, assuming it was a prank. Mia's ex had been petty enough to spam them with pizza deliveries last month. Emily typed a quick reply, "Wrong number." She set the phone aside, returning to her textbook. But then, 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. "He's outside your window. Don't let him see you." A cold prickle crept up her spine. Her dorm was on the 4th floor. Outside the window, she hesitated, then crept toward the glass, peeling back the edge of the curtain. The parking lot below was empty, illuminated by flickering street lamps. Rain streaked the pane, distorting the world beyond. "Nothing. Who is this? Stop messing around," she typed. The response was almost instant. "You shouldn't have answered." Photo followed. Emily's breath hitched. It was a grainy black and white image of her dorm building taken from outside. In the storm, the lens was tilted upward, focused on her window. Behind the rain-spattered glass, a blurred figure stood. She was visible in the photo, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of her desk lamp. Panic clawed at her throat. She whipped around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the room. But Mia was sound asleep across from her, and the door was locked. She quickly texted, "How did you take this? What do you want?" No reply. The next morning, Emily dismissed it as a creepy hoax. But when Mia left for class, the messages resumed. "He's closer now." Another photo followed. Emily standing in the dorm hallway earlier that morning, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The timestamp read 8:14 a.m. just 10 minutes ago. Her hands shook as she called the number. It rang once, then disconnected. She tried again. This time, a voicemail answered, a hollow, mechanical voice reciting, "The number you have reached is not in service." By afternoon, the messages grew stranger. "They buried me under the red oak. Find me." Attached was a photo of a gnarled tree Emily recognized from the edge of campus, the university's oldest landmark. Nicknamed the hanging tree by students after urban legends claimed it was once used for vigilante executions. Her stomach churned at the thought. That's when the noises began. At night, Emily heard scratching at the window, a sound like branches dragging across glass. But when she looked, nothing was there. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, now filled with photos of her taken from impossible angles, her walking to the library, her buying coffee, her sleeping, always accompanied by cryptic warnings. "He smells your fear. Don't trust a librarian. They never found my body." The messages were relentless, and with each new one, Emily felt more trapped, more alone. The walls of her dorm room seemed to close in around her. She couldn't escape the feeling that something or someone was watching her. It was as though every step she took was being followed, every breath she exhaled heard by unseen ears. Desperate, Emily confided in Mia, who shrugged it off. "It's some loser with a drone and too much time," reported to campus security. But campus security found nothing. The number was untraceable. The photos metadata wiped clean. No one believed her. On Friday night, Emily sat alone in the dorm. Mia was out with friends, and the place felt unusually empty. Her phone buzzed again, and when she checked the screen, her blood ran cold. "Meet me at the tree, 11:59 p.m., or he'll take you instead." She shouldn't have gone. She knew that. But curiosity or something darker pulled her there, like a magnet drawing her closer to something she couldn't quite understand. Maybe it was the desperation to end the torment, to finally put an end to the constant fear that plagued her. Maybe it was something darker, something inside her that whispered she had no choice. The red oak loomed in the moonlight, its branches skeletal, reaching for the heavens like twisted fingers. Emily's flashlight trembled in her grip as she approached. At the base of the tree, the earth looked disturbed, freshly dug. Her phone buzzed one last time. "Dig," she knelt, her fingers sinking into the cold soil. The air was thick with tension, her heartbeat pounding in her chest as she clawed at the dirt. Minutes later, her nails struck something solid, a rotting wooden box. She pulled it from the ground with trembling hands, the smell of damp earth filling her nose. Inside was a cracked smartphone, its screen lit with a single unsent draft. "Help me, he's watching. Don't trust." The draft was dated October 31st, 2003, 20 years to the day. The words seemed to mock her, their meaning impossible to understand. The screen flickered for a moment, and then it went black. A twig snapped behind her. Emily froze. The flashlight illuminated a figure standing inches from her face, a man, his features stretched into a grotesque smile, his eyes hollow and dark. "You shouldn't have answered," he whispered, his voice cold and hollow. It echoed the exact cadence of the text messages she'd received. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the man's twisted grin widened. He reached out, his claw-like fingers brushing against her cheek. She stumbled back, but before she could run, the screen of the old phone in her hand flickered to life again, displaying a new photo. Emily, right now, her face frozen in terror. As the man's hand reached for her throat, the world around her seemed to spin. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The man moved closer, his presence suffocating, his breath cold against her skin. She felt paralyzed, trapped in the nightmare she had walked into. The man's voice was low, a raspy whisper that made her skin crawl. "You should have never answered." And then darkness. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The photo, taken from outside her dorm, lingered in her mind, a constant reminder that she was not alone, despite trying to convince herself it was a prank. The text messages had escalated in a way that felt too real. And then came the message about the red oak dot. By the time evening fell, Emily's anxiety had grown unbearable. She couldn't focus on her studies, couldn't concentrate on anything but the creeping sensation that something was watching her. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the room, and every creak of the dorm building sent her heart racing. When Mia returned to the room, Emily didn't even try to hide her distress. "I keep getting these weird messages," Emily admitted, holding her phone up. "Look at this one. It says he smells your fear." Mia raised an eyebrow, glancing over at the phone screen. "It's probably some creep with a lot of time on his hands. Maybe a hacker or something. Just block the number and forget about it." Emily shook her head, still staring at the messages. "I've tried blocking it, but the photos, they're taken from places I've been. Places I didn't tell anyone I was going." "All right, calm down. You're overthinking this," Mia said dismissively, throwing her backpack onto her bed. "You're stressing yourself out." But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that Mia wasn't listening. This wasn't just some prank. It couldn't be. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the city below. Her phone buzzed again. She jumped, reaching for it with trembling hands. "And no number. You've been warned." Now he's closer. Another photo appeared. This time, it was a close-up shot of her walking out of the building that morning, just a few minutes after she had left for class. The timestamp, 9:32 a.m., Emily's blood ran cold. How was this happening? How had they been watching her? She glanced at Mia, who was already sound asleep. Emily's pulse quickened as she turned her attention back to the phone. "Unknown number. Don't trust anyone." Emily stared at the message, paralyzed with fear. She thought about going to campus security, but the photos so real, so specific, wouldn't be easy to explain. What if no one believed her? What if she was making a mistake? And all of this was just in her head. But then, there it was again, the scratching sound at the window. Emily froze. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct. A scraping noise. Something was definitely moving outside her window. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly rose from her bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer through the glass. There was nothing out there, just rain. But the feeling in her gut told her otherwise. She wasn't alone. The phone buzzed again. The text was brief but chilling. "Unknown number. He's here. Don't look." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to do. Her mind raced, weighing her options. Should she go to the door and look outside? Should she call the police? But no, it was too risky. She had to be careful. This was no ordinary stalker. There was something more to this, something sinister. The scratching grew louder, closer. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything unusual. The desk lamp flickered once, then twice. She reached for her phone again, but the screen was blank. A sudden knock at the door startled her. She froze. The knocking came again, harder this time, as if someone was impatiently waiting outside. Her pulse raced, and her skin prickled with fear. She thought she heard a voice whispering through the door, but it was too faint to make out. "Emily?" It was a low, hollow voice. one she didn't recognize. Her mind spun. She had to know what was going on. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. Quietly, Emily grabbed her jacket and slipped out of the room, careful not to wake Mia. She tiptoed through the dark hallway of the dorm building, trying not to make a sound as she approached the main exit. The air outside was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the building. Emily stepped out into the damp night, the rain still falling in a steady stream. The campus was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. She clutched her phone tightly, its screen still glowing faintly with the ominous messages. Her thoughts raced as she walked toward the edge of campus. The red oak tree, the spot where the old urban legend was said to come to life. Her stomach churned as she approached it, every step sending a chill down her spine. The tree stood in the moonlight, its gnarled branches twisting and creaking as if it were alive. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and she stopped a few feet away from the base of the tree, scanning the ground. There was a strange stillness in the air, a heaviness that pressed in around her. Her phone buzzed again. Emily didn't hesitate to check it. An unknown number. Dig. Her hands shook as she knelt down, feeling the cold earth beneath her fingers. She had no idea what she was looking for, but the urgency in the message told her she had no choice but to follow it. The earth was soft here, and as she dug, she could feel something hard underneath the soil. She scraped at the dirt, uncovering a small, weathered wooden box. Her heart raced as she opened it, revealing an old, cracked smartphone. It was covered in dirt, but the screen flickered to life as soon as she touched it. The last message was still there, frozen on the screen. "Help me. He's watching. Don't trust." The message trailed off, and then the phone began to glitch, displaying a new image. The photo was taken just moments ago. Emily gasped, her heart stopping for a moment. The image was a photo of her right then, standing next to the tree. Behind her, a figure loomed, hidden in the shadows. It was the same man from the earlier texts, the one who had been sending her the messages all along. Emily's hand trembled as the figure in the photo seemed to move, his face coming into sharp focus, his eyes hollow and menacing. "You shouldn't have answered," the voice echoed from behind her, sending a shock of terror through her body. She spun around just as the figure lunged at her, his hands outstretched. Story 4. The Haunted Camera. Emma Richards had always been captivated by photography. As a fine arts student at Edgewater University, she had a natural ability to see the world through a unique lens, capturing moments in time that others might miss. Her camera was an extension of herself, always by her side, ready to preserve the beauty and mystery of the world around her. One rainy afternoon, while browsing a vintage store near campus, Emma stumbled upon something peculiar. Tucked away in a dusty corner of the shop, she found an old Polaroid camera. Its leather strap was worn, the lens fogged up, and it had an aged, almost eerie look. Despite the camera's neglected appearance, something about it caught her eye. It wasn't like the other cameras on display. This one seemed to carry a strange energy, almost as if it had a story to tell. The shopkeeper, a man with glasses too large for his face, noticed Emma's interest and approached her with a cryptic smile. "Ah, that old thing," he said, his voice hoarse and raspy. "You sure you want that one? It's not like the others. It has a history." Emma, curious, raised an eyebrow. "What kind of history?" The man leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It said, to capture more than just moments. It captures things." He gave a slow and settling smile. "If you decide to buy it, you'll see." Emma was taken aback by his odd words but brushed it off. She didn't believe in such things, and the camera was priced reasonably. Besides, she had always liked vintage items, and the camera's unique look would make a great addition to her collection. She handed the shopkeeper the cash and walked out with the camera, not fully understanding what she had just bought. That night, Emma sat on the floor of her dorm room, excited to test out the Polaroid. She opened the back of the camera and found a single, faded photo already inside. It was an image of a small, isolated house, its windows dark and empty. The house looked strange, almost as if it didn't belong in the real world. It gave off an eerie, unsettling vibe. She turned the photo over but found no description or date, only a faintly written name, Grayson House. Feeling a bit uneasy but intrigued, Emma decided to snap a few test photos. She pointed the camera toward her desk. Pressing the shutter button, the camera clicked, and within moments, a small Polaroid photo developed in front of her eyes. It was a clear image of her cluttered desk, filled with textbooks, papers, and her laptop. She smiled at the simplicity of it, thinking it would be a fun addition to her photo collection. She took another photo, this time of the empty dorm room. As the Polaroid slowly developed, Emma could hear a strange clicking sound, almost like the camera was moving on its own. She looked down and saw that a new photo was emerging, one that she hadn't taken. The photo was of the outside of her dorm building, taken from an angle that was impossible. The image was dark, the shadows of the trees and the parking lot stretching beneath the streetlights. But what truly unsettled her was the figure standing beneath her window. It was blurry and indistinct, but it looked like someone. No, something was standing there watching her. Emma's heart raced. She hadn't opened the window, nor had she seen anyone outside. She had been alone in her room for hours. She picked up the photo, her hands trembling, and tried to make sense of it. It was impossible. Before she could process what was happening, the camera clicked again. Emma looked at the new photo with dread. This time, the figure was closer, its silhouette now standing right below her window. It was darker, more defined, but still, its features were hidden in the shadows. Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What was going on? How could this be happening? She set the camera down quickly and rushed to the window. Her hands were shaking as she pulled back the curtains. Outside, the parking lot was empty. There was no figure, no one standing beneath her window. The night was still. The only sound, the rain tapping against the glass. Confused and unnerved, Emma returned to her desk and picked up the camera. It clicked again, developing another image before she could even react. This time, the photo showed her reflection in the window. But there was something wrong with it. Behind her, in the reflection, stood a dark shape, an indistinct figure that seemed to be hovering just out of view. Its presence was undeniable, yet it remained hidden, watching her closely. She stared at the photo, trying to rationalize it, but the feeling of dread gnawed at her. Her pulse quickened, and she backed away from the camera. This was too much. She had to stop, but before she could gather her thoughts, the camera clicked once more, and another photo developed before her eyes. It was a picture of her standing by the window, just as before, but this time, the figure in the background was no longer hidden. It had moved, its shape now fully visible. Standing just behind her reflection, the figure's face was obscured by darkness, but its presence was undeniable. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized that it was no longer just a photo. The figure was moving closer. The camera clicked again. The sound was like a death knell. Echoing in the quiet room, Emma reached for the camera, but her hands were frozen, gripped by a fear she couldn't explain. She looked at the photo in her hand. The figure had taken a step closer. Its face was still obscured, but it was no longer standing still. It was moving toward her. At this point, Emma knew she could no longer ignore what was happening. This wasn't just a malfunctioning camera or a series of odd coincidences. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The camera, this ancient Polaroid, was capturing something it shouldn't be, something that was very real and very dangerous. With trembling hands, Emma placed the camera down on the desk, its clicking finally stopping. She felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on her chest. Was she being watched? Was the camera somehow linked to whatever this was? But before she could make a decision, the camera clicked again. This time, the photo was different. Was not an image of her, or her room, or even her reflection. Instead, it was a photo of the street outside, taken from a low angle. The streetlights cast eerie shadows on the wet pavement, and the figure from the previous photos was now walking down the sidewalk, moving toward her building. It was closer, now much closer. A chill ran down her spine. She stood frozen, unable to move, staring at the photo in her hand. The figure was almost at the entrance of her dorm. Suddenly, the room grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop, and Emma shivered as she felt a presence in the air, something intangible but heavy, like a shadow creeping into the room. She looked up, and for a moment, everything seemed still. The wind outside howled, and the rain pelted against the window. But within the room, there was a suffocating silence. Then, the door creaked. It was barely audible, but Emma could hear it. She quickly turned her head, heart pounding. The door was locked, but the sound was unmistakable, the soft scrape of wood against the frame. The camera clicked again. The photo that developed was of the door to her room open. Emma's blood froze. She hadn't touched the door since locking it earlier. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The room felt heavier now, as though the air itself was pressing down on her. She took a hesitant step toward the door, her eyes fixed on the gap between the frame and the wall. Shadows danced along the edges, flickering unnaturally despite the absence of light. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for the doorknob. Her fingers brushing against the cold metal, she hesitated, then pulled the door open wider. The hallway beyond was empty, bathed in dim fluorescent light. But something was off. The wall seemed distorted, stretched unnaturally, as though reality itself was bending. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Emma stepped into the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. The camera hung loosely from her neck, its weight suddenly unbearable. She glanced down at it, half expecting it to click again, but it remained silent for now. The hum grew louder, vibrating through her bones, and she realized it was coming from the end of the hall. She followed the sound, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she approached, she saw a figure standing at the far end, its back to her. It was the same figure from the photos, but now it was larger, more solid. It turned its head slowly, and Emma caught a glimpse of its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where its features should have been, there was only a void, swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull at her very soul. She stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure began to move toward her, its steps deliberate and unhurried. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The camera clicked again. jolting her back to reality. She looked down at the photo that had just developed. It was an image of herself, standing exactly where she was now, but the figure was gone. In its place was a message, scrawled in jagged handwriting across the bottom of the photo. "You can't run." Emma dropped the camera, her scream echoing through the empty halls. The figure stopped moving, tilting its head as though listening. Then, without warning, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything, and Emma felt the presence closing in. She turned and ran blindly, her hands clawing at the walls as she searched for an exit. But the hallway twisted and turned, leading her in circles. Every door she tried was locked, every window sealed shut. She was trapped. Finally, she collapsed to the floor, sobbing, clutching the Polaroid camera to her chest. It clicked one last time, and she forced herself to look at the final photo. It was an image of the Grayson house, the same one she found inside the camera when she first bought it. Only this time, the windows weren't dark. They glowed with an unnatural light, and in each window, she could see the same faceless figure staring back at her. Beneath the photo, the message read, "Welcome home." As the realization hit her, Emma felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there, or so she thought. Because when she looked back at the photo, she saw herself standing in the doorway of the Grayson house, the camera raised to her face, and behind her, the figure smiled. Emma's mind raced as she tried to piece together what was happening. She remembered the shopkeeper's cryptic warning, "It captures things." She realized now that the camera wasn't just cursed, it was alive, feeding on her fear, pulling her deeper into its web. Each photo she took brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to the edge of madness. She knew she had to destroy the camera. But how? It seemed indestructible, its power growing stronger with every click. Desperate, Emma grabbed a hammer from her toolbox and brought it down on the camera with all her might. The plastic casing cracked, but the lens remained intact, glowing faintly, as though mocking her efforts. She struck it again and again, tears streaming down her face, until finally the camera shattered into pieces. But instead of relief, she felt a surge of terror. The shards of the camera began to glow brighter, forming a swirling vortex on the floor. The air around her crackled with energy, and she felt herself being pulled toward it. "No," she screamed, clawing at the ground. But it was too late. The vortex swallowed her whole, dragging her into a realm of darkness and despair. When she opened her eyes, she found herself standing in front of the Grayson house. The windows glowed ominously, and the figure stood on the porch, beckoning her inside. She tried to resist, but her legs moved forward of their own accord. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The interior of the house was a labyrinth of endless corridors, each lined with mirrors that reflected not her image, but the faceless figure. It was everywhere, watching her, waiting for her. She ran through the halls searching for an exit, but every door led her back to the same room, a room filled with Polaroid cameras, each displaying a photo of her at different stages of her life. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a single photo. She approached it hesitantly, her heart pounding. It was an image of her, standing exactly where she was now, but this time she was holding a camera, pointing it at herself. The realization dawned on her too late. The camera clicked, and the photo developed in her hands. It was blank. She looked up, and the mirrors shattered, filling the room with piercing screams. The figure emerged from the shadows, its void-like face inches from hers. It whispered a single word, "Forever," and then everything went black. Story 5, The lost message. Hannah Mitchell was never the type to believe in anything supernatural. She was grounded, logical, and had always been the kind of person who dismissed strange occurrences as coincidences. Working as a marketing manager in a thriving city was enough to keep her busy and focused. Her days were consumed by meetings, deadlines, and social events. But all of that changed one chilly November evening when she received a text that was far from ordinary. It started as a typical evening. Hannah sat in her small apartment, surrounded by piles of paperwork that needed her attention. The rain pattered gently against the windows, and the soft hum of the city filled the background. Her phone buzzed suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. The message came from an unknown number, with no name attached to it. Hannah hesitated before opening it, but her curiosity got the better of her. She unlocked the screen. Unknown number. Are you alone? Hannah's brow furrowed. It seemed like a strange message, especially since she hadn't shared her number with anyone she didn't know. She paused, considering whether it was a prank or someone who had dialed the wrong number. She quickly typed a reply. Hannah, who is this? The reply came swiftly. Unknown number. It's too late now. He's already here. A cold shiver ran down Hannah's spine. She couldn't understand why the message unsettled her so much. She was used to receiving weird texts from telemarketers, but something about this one felt different. For some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't meant for her. Her mind raced, thinking of the possibilities. Maybe it was a mistake, or perhaps someone was playing a sick joke on her. But just as she was about to dismiss it, another message arrived. Unknown number. Look outside. Hannah froze, her pulse quickening. The words seemed so simple, yet they felt like a command. She stood up from her desk, walked over to the window, and cautiously peeked through the blinds. The street below was empty, drenched in the light from the street lamps. No one was in sight. Confused, she shook her head and turned back to the phone. Another message appeared. Unknown number. Don't open the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She walked back to the door of her apartment, a sense of unease washing over her. Was someone outside? She hadn't heard anything, but the text seemed so urgent, so deliberate. She considered calling the police, but the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. After all, no one was outside. Just as she was about to dismiss the idea entirely, her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. He's behind you. The blood drained from Hannah's face. She spun around, but there was no one there. The apartment felt eerily silent, the air heavy with tension. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She quickly grabbed her phone and typed a message. Hannah, who are you? What do you want from me? The reply came almost instantly. Unknown number. The message is for you. Hannah stared at the screen in disbelief. What message? The strange texts kept coming, each one more cryptic and unnerving than the last. Her phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. Check your inbox. Her inbox was empty. There was no new email, no notification, no unread messages. She stared at her phone in confusion. What was going on? Why had she received these strange messages? And why was someone seemingly watching her? As she sat down on the couch, still feeling the weight of the bizarre encounter, she began to replay everything in her mind. Had she missed something? A clue? A warning? Her phone buzzed again, this time with a different notification, a photo attachment. Her heart skipped a beat as she tapped to open it. The photo was blurry and grainy, but there was no mistaking it. The picture was of her apartment building, taken from a distance. In the corner of the frame, she could just make out the shadowy outline of a figure standing outside her door. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, suffocating. She rushed to the door and checked the peephole, her hand trembling. There was nothing, no sign of anyone, but that image of figure standing outside her door didn't seem like a coincidence. She stepped away from the door, her phone still in hand. The messages kept coming. Unknown number. It's too late now. You shouldn't have opened the door. Hannah's pulse raced. She took a deep breath and tried to calm herself, but her mind raced, jumping from one horrifying possibility to the next. It felt as though she were being pulled into a nightmare that wouldn't let go. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Hannah's heart leaped in her chest, and she froze. She looked around the room, every shadow seeming more sinister than before. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. The message is waiting for you. You just have to open the door. Hannah stared at her phone, her mind clouded with fear and confusion. Why was she being targeted? Who was behind these messages? And what did they mean? There was only one thing left to do. Despite every instinct telling her not to, she knew she had to face whatever was waiting behind that door. Hannah stood frozen in front of her apartment door, her phone trembling in her hand. The messages had grown more insistent, more menacing, and now they were demanding something she didn't want to do. Open the door. Her logical mind screamed at her to ignore it, to call the police or barricade herself inside. But deep down, a gnawing curiosity pulled at her, urging her to confront whatever was waiting for her. She took a hesitant step toward the door, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as if an invisible force was trying to hold her back. She reached for the peephole again, squinting through the tiny lens. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent light casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. Still, there was no one there. But then, something caught her eye, a faint movement at the edge of her vision. She blinked, thinking it was just her imagination. When she looked again, she saw it, a shadow shifting near the staircase at the far end of the hall. It wasn't human. It moved too quickly, too fluidly, like smoke curling through the air. Hannah's breath hitched, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her trance. Another message appeared on the screen. Unknown number. You're running out of time. Hannah clenched her fists, trying to steady her nerves. Who are you? She whispered aloud. Though she knew no one would answer, the silence in the apartment was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the rain against the windows. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the corners. But everything seemed normal. Too normal. Taking a deep breath, she decided to act. If this was some kind of prank, she needed to put an end to it. She grabbed a baseball bat from the closet, holding it tightly as she approached the door. Her hands shook as she unlocked the deadbolt and turned the handle. Slowly, she cracked the door open, just wide enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty. No shadowy figures, no strange movements, just the usual quiet emptiness of her building. Hannah exhaled in relief, but the feeling didn't last long. As she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the screen in horror. Unknown number. Wrong door. Before she could react, the apartment door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Hannah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, and she was trapped outside. Panic set in as she frantically pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one answered. Then she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the door. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Hannah backed away, her eyes glued to the door. Scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to emanate from the wood itself. "Open the door." The voice was distorted, unrecognizable. Yet it sent chills down her spine. Hannah shook her head, refusing to comply. "No," she muttered under her breath. "This isn't real." Her phone buzzed again, startling her. She looked down at the screen, her hands trembling. "Unknown number. It's not the door you should be afraid of." Hannah's gaze darted up and down the hallway, searching for any sign of danger. That's when she noticed it, the elevator. At the far end of the hall, its doors were slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within, a cold draft seeped out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of damp earth and decay. Her stomach churned as she realized the source of the whispers wasn't the door, it was the elevator. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Hannah found herself drawn to it. Her feet moved forward as if controlled by an unseen force. With each step, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that echoed in her mind. They weren't speaking English, they sounded ancient, guttural, like a language long forgotten by time. When she reached the elevator, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the button. The voices urged her onward, their tone both pleading and menacing. Finally, she pressed the button, and the doors slid open with a groan. Inside, the elevator was pitch black, save for a single red light blinking in the corner. The air was thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Hannah stepped inside, her pulse racing. As soon as she did, the doors slammed shut behind her, plunging her into complete darkness. The elevator began to move, descending slowly despite there being no buttons pressed. Hannah's phone buzzed wildly in her hand, lighting up the cramped space. She looked at the screen, her blood turning to ice. Unknown number. "Welcome to the basement." The elevator came to a sudden stop, jolting her forward. The doors creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in flickering red light. The walls were lined with rusted pipes, and the floor was slick with water. The smell of mold and rot filled the air, making her gag. At the far end of the corridor, she could see a faint glow emanating from beneath a heavy metal door. Hannah hesitated, torn between fear and morbid curiosity. The voices in her head urged her forward, whispering promises of answers if she dared to enter. Summoning what little courage she had left, she walked toward the door. As she approached, she noticed something etched into the surface, a series of symbols that looked like they belonged to an ancient language. They glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the red light. Her phone buzzed one final time. She looked down at the screen, her vision blurring with tears. Unknown number. Find the message. With shaking hands, she pushed the door open. Inside, she found a small, circular room with walls covered in mirrors. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a crumpled piece of paper. Hannah approached it cautiously, her reflection multiplying endlessly in the mirrors. She picked up the paper and unfolded it, her hands trembling. The message was written in jagged handwriting, the ink smudged as though hastily scrawled. "He will find you." Before she could process what it meant, the mirrors shattered simultaneously, shards of glass raining down around her. The room filled with piercing screams, and the figure from the photo appeared before her, its faceless void staring directly into her soul. It reached out, its cold fingers brushing against her cheek, and then everything went black. we've come to the end of another thrilling journey together. If these stories have touched you, just as it touched us, make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your words mean the world to us. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. We have plenty more chilling tales to share, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Stay curious, stay brave, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Until then, keep the whispers close. Subscribe to Enter the Unknown.